There is no price tag too big. That's how Donald Trump, who was elected Tuesday night on a wave of voter rage about the cost of things, describes his top policy priority, which is mass deportations of millions of undocumented immigrants currently in the United States. NBC News reports this, quote, President-elect Trump told NBC News on Thursday that one of his first priorities upon taking office in January would be to make the border, quote, strong and powerful. Sorry. Sometimes it is beautiful when he talks about it. When questioned about his campaign promise of mass deportations, Trump said his administration will have no choice but to carry them out. And when asked about the cost of this plan, he said, quote, it is not a question of a price tag. It is not really. We have no choice. When people have killed and murdered, when drug lords have destroyed countries, and now they're going to go back to those countries because they're not staying here, there is no price tag, end quote. But of course, there will be a price tag. And the price tag that communities all across the country are going to pay is potentially devastating to the economy. Trump is targeting 11 million undocumented immigrants. They live in every town, in every state, in every corner of the country, meaning that mass deportations will require an operation of a size and scale that may simply not even be feasible, let alone affordable. One estimate says that it will cost $88 billion to deport 1 million undocumented immigrants each year. Again, it's a strain on the economy of a scale that costs Democrats any political wins in 2024, meaning that Trump's promise of a good economy, one better than the one we have right now, and his pledge of mass deportations are in immediate and direct contradiction with one another. One study finds that, quote, mass deportation would lead to a loss of 4.2% to 6.8% of annual U.S. GDP, or $1.1 trillion to $1.7 trillion. In comparison, the U.S. GDP shrunk by 4.3% during the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009. An economist tells Bloomberg this, quote, if you deport a large number of workers, you're going to probably create shortages in some industries. And when there are shortages, demand's going to outstrip supply and prices are going to rise. So in the short run, I would expect that there will be inflation. So all that, and just to say nothing of the sheer, almost unfathomable cruelty for the vast majority of us in watching this happen, again, in every community, in every state, all across the country. More than 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country. 4/5 of them have been living in this country for more than a decade. According to the Pew Research Center, 22 million people live in households with an undocumented immigrant as part of them, their family and their household. Quote, about 4.4 million U.S.-born children under 18 live with an unauthorized illegal parent. And if we look back at what happened in public, the public record from the last time Trump tackled the issue of immigration, he was undeterred by any legal limits and the human suffering that ensued from the child separation policy. In fact, Trump aides said out loud and on television that the optics of the suffering and the crying of the children, that was the point, that was the deterrent. Joining our conversation, ACLU National Legal Director Cecilia Wong. She was previously the director of the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project. NBC News correspondent Jacob Soboroff is back with us. He's the executive producer of the film Separated, which is out now. Here with me at the table for the whole hour, co-anchor of MSNBC's The Weekend, Alicia Menendez. Alicia, I start with you.
This is going to play out on a variety of fronts. And one thing that I want to make very clear is that what you have heard from the Trump administration is they're going to prioritize recent arrivals with a criminal record. And when he talks about it, that is drug lords and gang members. It also, though, can be defined as someone who's committed a petty crime and misdemeanor while in the United States. And then suddenly there is reporting that is also referencing dreamers, those who came here as children, as you said, have been living in this country for years. So big question. I think there are multiple camps within the Trump administration. How are they going to define the criteria and the prioritization of who it is that they plan to deport? There is the legal fight that Cecilia, ACLU, other organizations are going to play out, not just around the deportations and the detention, but also around the racial profiling and the surveillance programs that likely come with it. There is the legislative fight. It is the sense of folks on the Hill that Republicans are going to try to ram through this funding mechanism during reconciliation. Opens up this question. Does Susan Collins, does Thom Tillis, do they agree to fund mass deportation in this country? Because the problem is, as you know, once you have instigated that mechanism, it can take 30 years to undo it. So we're not just talking about, changes that could take place in the next 6 months. We're talking about changes that then become very hard to undo. There are the states. You have Governor Maura Healey in Massachusetts who said, I'm not doing this. I'm not using my state police to deport people, round up people inside my state. So all of a sudden, these governors in Democratic states become much more important as a line of defense in these programs. And then most importantly, this is what I want to make sure I end on, is the community response, right? There are communities that are absolutely wrecked right now by the reality of what is happening. I talked to Astrid Silva. She runs Dream Big Nevada. That's the only advocacy group in that state that is run by Dreamers. And she said to me, it's not a question of if we're getting screwed. It's a question of when. People are preparing paperwork for guardianship documents, for transfers of deeds. They're filling out forms that say, this is my child's nickname. These are the things that they're allergic to, so that if your child comes home from school and you, their parent, are not there, the person who then takes over custody of them knows how to care for your child. That is the reality of what is happening on the ground.
And Trump made gains with Latino voters, men and women.
Some of whom just didn't believe that he was actually going to do this. Some of whom really believed this idea of prioritization of recent arrivals with criminal records. And again, there's debate within Team Trump over how they are going to do this, what it's going to look like. Jason Hauser, who's the former ICE chief of staff, has a sort of detailing of anticipated strategies that they imagine. And one of the things that Homan, who is very much seen as a contender to run ICE or DHS, is looking at is, instead of doing mass deportations, going after head of household, so that then folks have the economic necessity to self-deport. I mean, they are looking at doing this in a variety of incredibly devious ways because they understand, it would seem, that the optics are not on their side here.
Jacob, this body of reporting that you've done, now the subject of the film Separated, we know what the optics are, and my understanding, mostly from your great reporting, is that the horrific optics are the point. Tell me how you think we should prepare for what's about to happen.
Well, I just want to put this in perspective, Nicole. And I'm saying this completely objectively, this is not my opinion, mass deportation is family separation. You just mentioned that there are millions of people in this country, maybe as many as 20 or more, who have an undocumented family member living within their house. And no matter who the Trump administration ultimately decides to go after, you had said that they were undeterred by the cruelty of the policy, and that indeed is true. They deliberately separated 5,500 children from their parents for no other reason than to harm people and scare others from coming to the country. And to remind everybody, the American Academy of Pediatrics called that government-sanctioned child abuse. Physicians for Human Rights said it met the United Nations definition of torture. And, frankly, I'll never forget what I saw inside those detention centers. But the question is, will they and can they move forward with it? Will that political support quickly erode? It was the one thing. It was the one major policy proposal that President Trump came out in the face of not bipartisan condemnation, but literally a universal condemnation of the policy. The Pope spoke out, I think many people will remember. There were people in the streets all over the world in the face of family separation. And Donald Trump, on June 20th, 2018, after we went inside those detention facilities on the 13th and on the 18th down in South Texas, said, as he signed an executive order in the White House, I didn't like the sight and the feeling of the families being separated. He recognized what that looked like, what it did to people across the country, and what it meant for him politically in this country, and he backed down. They decided they were going to stop the policy. It didn't mean he doesn't want to continue with the policy. He told Kirstjen Nielsen, I reported in my book, And we talk about it in the film that he wanted to reinstitute the policy if he was given the opportunity. But they understand what this means. And I think, as simply as we can say it as a journalist, mass deportation is family separation. Are they going to go through with a family separation policy on the scale that this country has never seen before, given the consequences that they faced the first time around? That's a choice that the Trump administration and President-elect Trump is going to have to make.